New 72 Radio, the voice, views, and visions of the collective.
Good morning, everyone. I am Len Young, and with me is my colleague Rebecca Shaw, who is a hypnotherapist. And usually we have Dr. Stela Susac-Pavic with us, but she is on vacation in her home country of Croatia. We had actually hoped to have her with us from Croatia. I think she is having a great time and with her family, and so is unable to join us. Today, we would like to talk about the subject of trauma. Trauma takes many different positions and definitions in our world. And both Rebecca and I work with people who have had various kinds of trauma. And we thought it would be valuable to talk about it, start a dialogue, maybe encourage you to be able to start dialogues with your own family about something that you see going on in your neighborhood or in the school or even in the country, and just bring it to a conscious level so you're aware of it, and then hopefully you're able to put it aside and address it and not just leave it without talking about it. So Rebecca had actually mentioned to me the other day, one of the dangers of trauma is that it becomes something of shame or something of fear or anxiety, and people don't talk about it. They bury it, you bury it in your bodies, and then it manifests in a different way in your lives. So we want to talk about it today, generally as a subject. And I pull back. I like to look at things from a macro level to see what does it mean for our world. And so I like to go out into the universe and look back at the earth and consider what that is. And earth itself can experience trauma. So Mother Earth, or Gaia from my mythology position, or just the earth as we know her, can have trauma. And we see a little of this happening with the warming of the earth in different places where different cycles the earth experiences is creating melting ice at the polar caps and rising waters. And we in Charleston are dealing with flooding. You in other places may be dealing with fires or volcanoes or different earth happenings. Those are responses to something the earth is experiencing. So today I'll call it trauma. It may not be what that is. That may be too simple. But if you look from the standpoint of the universe in, that can be a trauma for the earth. But if you come in a little closer, we can see that cultures experience trauma. And this is where it would be very nice to have Stela's input, because I've heard her speak about the war in the whole area of the old Yugoslavia. So that area from which Croatia broke away and became one of the countries, the people living there have experienced trauma. Certainly Germany and the whole of Europe experienced trauma, and the United States. Today we have issues about immigration going on in the United States and families being separated. Those are definitely traumas. But if we bring it in closer, they're group traumas. So you can get into a family trauma with the death of a family member, or it can be a school trauma where a group of 8th grade girls are mean to one other girl, or, these are all situations that bring it home to us how focused and central it can be just to our lives. And then, of course, there's personal trauma, and that probably is the most significant, in that human beings in their own trauma actually greet other human beings and will take that trauma with them whenever they have a relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship or whether it's just a close friend or just an acquaintance. So the earth, culture, groups, personal trauma, there are all these multiple levels. And in addition to that, they can cause things. Trauma can cause things. So we're going to talk about it today, just to give you that foundation to be aware of it, so you might be able to empower others to do something about how they're living and how perhaps a personal trauma or a trauma in their lives are affecting or is affecting how they function. So I have definitions of trauma, Rebecca, but would you like to chime in here a little bit and then I can come back?
No, go ahead. I think that would be great for you to give that definition first.
Okay. Well, I looked it up. I looked on the internet because I know how I look at trauma from a Tomatis method standpoint. But just the definitions, there are a couple. One was a deeply distressing experience, like the death of a child, as I mentioned, or a physical injury, something that would bring damage or a wound. But I thought was interesting, if you have multiple traumas, the word is traumata. Have you ever heard that, Rebecca? I hadn't heard that.
No.
Then I looked at Webster's dictionary and it went a little bit further. One is an injury to living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent, so something from outside of you, or a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or a physical injury. But third, it can be an emotional upset. It also can be an agent, a force, or a mechanism that causes trauma from the outside of us. So it seems to me there can be multiple ways we experience trauma, and then even calling it trauma brings it into a position of focus of something we want to be aware of. So some examples of that would be even something as early as the birthing process. Some births are very difficult. Babies come out backwards. They come out with the cord wrapped around their necks. So something from the very early beginning of life on Earth can be a trauma that informs how we address life, how we look at living, and how we look at relationships. An auto accident, a sports injury, a divorce that can actually cause trauma for the people in the couple, for the children, for the family around them, an alcoholic parent or an alcoholic spouse, a large school shooting, or, for us here in Charleston, and I wasn't living here, the AME church shooting, the murders of those 9 people. When I came to town 2 months later, after it had happened, I could feel it as I drove into town. I felt this sort of pall over the city. And so that meant the entire community was drawn into the trauma of this shooting, although the church itself was so forgiving and loving, it actually started to change things. So it was amazing to watch, and the city is still healing from that. So those are just some ideas, and I have ways that we approach it from the Tomatis method. So I'll certainly speak about Tomatis and how we look at traumas and what traumas are to a consultant or a practitioner. But I'll throw the ball to you, Rebecca, because I know you deal with trauma all the time.
Yeah. So in my practice in hypnotherapy, it wasn't really the original intention for me to be working with trauma. I went into hypnosis to help people with everyday problems. So smoking, weight loss, and even emotional blocks, emotional stress. And what became clear pretty quickly is that many issues that we have in our day-to-day life actually stem back to childhood trauma. And recently, a few years ago, there was a TED Talk by a doctor who brought forward a study. And the study was about this concept called adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences, or the short term for that are ACEs, ACES. ACEs are significant in that They are stressful or traumatic events that occur to a child, and this can include abuse, neglect, but it also can include things that you wouldn't think of right away as trauma. So, Len, you mentioned some of them. So when we think of trauma, we might think for a child that might be physical abuse or sexual abuse, but it can also be verbal abuse, neglect. It could be having a parent in the household that's going through or has some type of alcohol abuse or substance abuse. It can even be household mental illness. I've worked with a client who has severe anxiety, and his father was extremely OCD. I've worked with people who have trauma from having a parent who was bipolar. So, and childhood trauma can even be parental separation or divorce. A parent goes to prison. But even more subtle things like I had a client who tracked his ADD, and I'll mention that more in a moment, tracked his attention deficit disorder back to a specific traumatic event where his mother dropped him off the first day of kindergarten at school in the rain and said, bye, see you later. And the child had never been to the school before, really actually didn't know what was going on, and interpreted that as an extremely traumatic event. So the key here to understand is trauma is interpretive. Trauma is subjective, meaning what's traumatic to one person, you might put me on a snowy ski slope, Black Diamond, and I'm going to be traumatized. And a good friend of mine is like joyous. So
I wouldn't be able to move.
right. So first of all, it's understanding what might cause the trauma, but then what's more powerful and interesting about this study, this ACEs study, is what does this actually do to people long term? So we understand ACEs, they're common, they're very common, and many people report that from just their childhood experiences. But what actually happens to people is they can have cognitive impairment, which there is a whole term now. I've been part of a series that's filmed, and it's called The Truth About ADD, ADHD, and it's this whole concept of phantom ADD and phantom ADHD, which the doctor talks about in this TED Talk, that oftentimes children are diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, and it's trauma to the mind. That basically what I've seen with my clients is that when you have a trauma as a child, it puts you into this low-level fight or flight, which could be a type of PTSD, which mimics the symptoms of ADD and ADHD. So that's something really I encourage people to look at, is if you have a child who has ADD or ADHD, and maybe you find that the meds aren't really working, or how you've been addressing it isn't working, it may stem back to childhood trauma. And to address that, you're looking at a whole new pathway of addressing the underlying problem if you can identify that it's something like that. And what's life-changing about that for many people is they think, oh, I was born this way, my brain is this way, I'm stuck this way, when actually if it does stem back to a traumatic event and it's just phantom ADHD, there are solutions for that.
It's encouraging.
So then other things that will happen from trauma is what they call health risk behaviors. So people getting addicted to drugs and alcohol to numb out the residual symptoms of trauma, which can be high emotional sensitivity, low resilience to stress, flashbacks, things like that. And then you take it to a whole new level where they're associating childhood trauma with people living shorter lives, people having a higher risk of heart disease, So there's a lot of health factors that are now being associated with um, with ACEs, lifetime depression, sleep disturbances. Yeah, so even poor dental health, which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Well, you know, when you were speaking about how early these can occur, I want to talk a little bit about what Dr. Tomatis, Alfred Tomatis, um, showed in the work that he started to do. He was an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And you might remember this, Rebecca, because I think we've discussed it before. But in utero, we hear through bone conduction, which is the mother's skeletal system, into the placenta. And we are surrounded as a fetus by fluids. So we can't really hear through air because there's no air in the sac. So we hear through bone conduction. And that bone conduction is where we first hear sound at about 4 or 5 months. And we start to hear language and sound then. So we're developing our brain and our system of communication starting halfway through pregnancy. So when we're born, we then come into air, we come into oxygen, and we start to breathe. So our communication is through air conduction, through our ear system. So our outer ear to the middle ear and then the inner ear into the brain. Well, if we have a trauma, this is how we address what's going on with any clients who come to us. If we have a trauma, it shows up by reverting to bone conduction at certain parts of our hearing, our tonal scale. And we don't know that exactly where that is unless we can do a listening test, which is a little bit like a hearing test. And we're able to see where there might be some confusion in the bone and the air conduction. But if we revert to bone conduction anywhere on the tonal scale, then we will have confused sounds coming into our ears. And that starts to interrupt our auditory processing. And auditory processing is a key word these days where in schools and even in work environments, if one can't follow what's happening in a team or instructions you're given on the job, you might not be able to follow through to finish a project that you're given or a task. And certainly in school, children are being are left behind in something because a teacher will speak to the entire class. And so children are hearing at different levels. And if they lose information, they may never be able to reclaim it or understand it. That in certain situations where children are motivated to study or parents are really pressing them and adding stress to their lives, they will go over and review material from a book, but it may not be what they were taught in class. And if in class they didn't process quickly enough, they'll have lost that information. So it's sort of a rat race and a very difficult thing to help a child. ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, any kind of situation where there was a trauma that might not even have a term on it can create issues with auditory processing. And it goes back to a trauma. So we address that in somebody's listening. It's a different way of looking at it. Traumas, though, are everything from an ear infection to traumatic brain injury or a stroke. So it's interesting to consider that word. Stella would talk about it very differently because when we've talked about it, she said, well, for us in the medical field, it is really an injury. A distinct injury, a dramatic injury of some kind, damaging the body, the physical body, or I guess the brain, the mental capacity.
Yeah. So then I guess we need to talk to our viewers about how do you address trauma? How can you heal trauma? So Len, I'll speak a little bit, and then I'd love for you to speak to how you would describe that the Tomatis method does do that for people. I've been through it myself, and both of my children have done the Tomatis series with Len. But to speak to how I address it in my work, in my practice, typically where I'm starting with people is what is going on in your current life that's creating a challenge for you. And I've had people who come for phobias and fears that go back to traumatic events. And so we're using hypnosis to clear the trauma at the deeper level of the mind, the subconscious mind. And we're using hypnosis to clear it on the emotional level. And it's something I really love, paired with other types of therapies like talk therapy or Tomatis method. And so that's something that's really powerful to do. And then, you know, sometimes people will have generalized anxiety. That can go back to, typically that always actually goes back to something traumatic in childhood, again, perceived to be traumatic by the child. So let's put it that way. Even depression can be masking trauma or suppressing trauma, suppressing the emotions of trauma. So I've often found that people who come for anxiety and depression to work with me, there are upsetting or traumatic events back in childhood that need to be cleared. And I think I've said this before in some of our shows, but we can be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years past an emotionally upsetting event, cognitively, chronologically, but on the level of emotion, there is no such thing as time for some particular emotionally challenging or traumatic events that have not been healed. And that is where I fall in love with hypnosis, where I fell in love with hypnosis more than 25 years ago. And that's what got me hooked on hypnotherapy, is clearing some traumatic things from my childhood through hypnosis. So in a practical sense, you know, people are not coming for years of therapy when they do hypnotherapy. It's actually tools and techniques that I'm taking you through to clear the emotions and the energy. I just had a guy yesterday who had a traumatic event at a doctor's office, and he asked me if I could hypnotize him to forget the experience. And I said, absolutely not. And you wouldn't want to be hypnotized to forget the experience, because then you might make that same mistake again. So the mind is built to remember things so that we avoid pain in the future. But what you can do is reframe that experience so you can clear the emotion and the energy connected with that memory or memories. So you can have the memory, have the wisdom, and but clear the emotions and the trauma in the physical body. That's really important to know, is as far as hypnosis is concerned, because I get that question quite a bit. Can you make me forget what happened?
That's really interesting, Rebecca, because that is the Tomatis method also works that way. It does, what it does is it strengthens the bone and air conduction, so it goes back to where it's supposed to be in nature. Nature gives us air conduction for hearing and for communicating, and bone conduction to fall back on. So if we have a larger amount of bone conduction going on, then the Tomatis method, the music, literally retrains the ear to make the air conduction stronger. And in the process, it reframes the emotion around the trauma. The memory doesn't disappear, but the emotion connected to it is minimized and often reduced to nothing. And so that makes a big difference. And I agree with you about not trying to wipe out the memory, because it's part of what we have as tools ourselves, not to repeat it or to learn from what we have, so we won't have to experience that same trauma again or that same experience. But it's interesting. Well, I had written down some ways we might address trauma if you are living in the country and have no access to anybody else but yourself. then I would start with exercise and diet. If you can identify the trauma, which is a big part of healing, is if you identify that there has been a trauma and you have experienced the trauma and how you experienced it, if there's another person involved, or if you were in the way of something, an extremely loud explosion or something, then recognize the trauma to begin with and then start to figure out ways to support yourself. And so supporting yourself may lead to healing. It doesn't always, but it can go a long way to helping you feel better about living in the world. And so I would say diet and exercise. So if you happen to be someone who always ate a lot of sugar and starch and that kind of thing, then consider feeding your body with healthier things. Go to vegetables and fruits and minimize the amount of meat, but eat meat, get protein, so do that. Exercise is important. So I find if there's been a particularly stressful situation, if I just go outside and walk, I feel better. And that means even walking around town, walking on the beach. I know you do that a lot, Rebecca, because you're so close to the beach. Walking in nature. I find when I walk among trees, I feel that I'm part of the earth, and I feel like whatever I've experienced has a place, and it's less important to the whole world than I've made it to me. So you can not minimize it, but you can change and reframe how you're looking at a trauma. And that is a beginning. That's a huge beginning to healing. But there are a lot of ways to address it. Some are free and some cost money. So depending on what you're able to access, you can go to Rebecca or come to me for the Tomatis method. And both of us work with people on a sliding scale if we need to. And then there are things like Feldenkrais, the Feldenkrais synergy method. I don't know if you've heard of it. Rubenfeld synergy, the Alexander method. These are specific methods that will help the practitioner holds different parts of your body, like will hold an elbow or hold your leg until your leg releases the hold that it's held. And you could have been holding your leg a certain way for 50 years, and all of a sudden that muscle is released because of the way the practitioner holds your leg or your muscle. And it's quite an interesting experience, because then you go through a detoxing situation. Your body says, oh, I don't have to hold my leg the same way I've held it for 50 years. Therefore, I walk differently. My hips are different. My whole body feels different. And oh my goodness, what is that thought that I had? I have never thought that way. So you just start to change, and it can address a trauma from that direction. But, you know, religion also has a place in the world for that. And if you have a really strong belief, whatever your religion, prayer and meditation at different times in the day can bring you peace, can bring a relief and a peace in your body and to your mind. So you're able to address your day, whether you're taking care of children or you're going to a job, whether you work 3 hours a day or 15. It's helpful to find some peace to go out to the world. So one of the things you might do is when you wake up in the morning, if it's at 5 in the morning or 4, as some teachers do, before you get out of bed, stretch. If you're even in the bed with a spouse, just move your legs and take your ankles and turn them around. It's amazing how good that feels. Flex and extend your fingers and your toes, and then pull your legs up and put them down. Do that exercise where you just tense your entire body and then release it. Do that 3 times, and you already will be awakening your body, and you're supporting your body. So if there's something that's really been overshadowing your life, you are starting to take some control of places where you can have control, which is your body, what you feed your temple, how you take care of yourself. Well, there are other things, and I've not done Tai Chi, but you know, the Japanese have a wonderful process of moving the body in air that brings peace to you. So you see it in gardens and in parks. People will just come together in a small group and do this just ethereal looking Tai Chi. Have you ever done Tai Chi, Rebecca?
It's been a long time, but I love it. I really love it. It's very soothing.
Well, I've done Qigong.
Meditation.
Yeah, it's amazing. So have you ever done Qigong?
I have not done Qigong.
So Qigong, I don't know the exact definition of it, but it's a way to discover how to pull all the energy in you down into a ball in front of you. Sorry, I have a itchy nose. And with that ball, you know where the energy is, and you can move it around in your body to help release some things in your body. And it also is very much like Tai Chi in that you can hold this energy you've trapped in your hands, just in this little area of your hands, and you can move with the energy. And it's very peaceful, very specific and intentional. And every time I've done it, I have felt such relief in my body. So it's an amazing thing. If you have a YMCA or YWCA somewhere close to you, they might offer those things. So doing any kind of exercise or enjoying something where you give your body a way to find some relief, that it may help you move towards dealing with the trauma. Talk therapy, medications are definitely out there, and we all know in our environment in the United States that this is something that we have fallen back to as Americans. Many people are medicated, and so that also can cause a trauma or traumas. So it's worth watching medications, see when they are really helpful and they can give you some relief, and then watch about how long you need them. Is it something you need to do forever? Is it something you can do for a period of time? And working with the doctor, don't just do it arbitrarily on your own. See if you can wean yourself from some of those medications and where you are in dealing with the trauma that you have. Have you addressed that, Rebecca? I know people on medications. It's something big in my practice.
Well, what's big in my practice, because people are looking at hypnosis as it is, as a natural approach to solving problems like PTSD and residuals from trauma, is people are typically coming to see me because they ultimately want to get off medication. And so they're working with their doctors. They're wanting to basically get to the root cause. They'll come in and they'll say, I don't want to just put a Band-Aid on it anymore. I don't want to just numb out anymore. I want to heal at the deeper level so that the need for the medication isn't there anymore. So people are looking to hypnotherapy to offer one pathway. Doesn't work for everyone, but for many people it does work, especially with anxiety. I've seen is to use hypnotherapy to heal at that deeper level and then release the need for the medications and even self-medicating with alcohol or drugs.
Mm-hmm. I see that as such a huge asset, what you're offering, because I know when I came to you for sugar, that the first time I saw a cookie or a brownie or a piece of cake, literally that day, I had this feeling of almost an illness. I can't go near it. And it was me. You had empowered me to have my own thoughts, say, no, my body doesn't really want that sugar, and to leave it alone. So you do a really good service, Rebecca, and I think in our world it's necessary. You know what, I was thinking in terms of what I'd studied in mythology, when some of this started, when did our world become so traumatized? And when did we start to deal with things? And even in talking about numbers of people, I was reminded yesterday in a conversation that in about 1942, we had 2.6 billion people in the world. Today, in 2018, so what is that, 68 years later or 70 years later, something like that, we are at 7 billion people. That is how fast it's traveled. I mean, it's amazing. So the land is stressed. The earth is stressed with the numbers of people we have on it. And then just that alone, things start to change. So I had a conversation about the Industrial Revolution. It was really interesting. But what has happened is industrialists needed people to work their factories. And so they started encouraging people to leave their farms and so then they started clear cutting the land and selling off all the trees, which takes away our oxygen on the earth. So there are several things going on. We're stressing the earth, we're moving people into cities, and we're taking them away from growing their own food and taking care of themselves and away on their own little plot of land. We had hunter-gatherers at that time. The hunter-gatherers have become entrepreneurs. I mean, they've become the people who create amazing businesses in our capitalist society, but their hunting and gathering has become ownership of things and money. And so it's taken not necessarily a great turn for what we're doing. Farming, though, was an earnest part of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it was go from the farming, it wasn't part of it, it was the step after hunter-gathering into farming, and then the Industrial Revolution started pushing people out, and it's still happening today. In some of the countries where large corporations are going in to get oil, or what they call resources, which are really not necessarily resources, they're still pushing natives into the cities to live and to work and to be part of industry. And that causes trauma. So it's interesting, if you can look at what's happening on the earth, maybe you can become more aware of how in your own life and what you feel is big to you but small in the community, you're under stress and you're under a trauma just in your everyday living. There are times when I look at the traffic in Charleston and feel like that can be a little traumatic too, because there just aren't enough roads and there are a lot of people. And I'll tell you one other thing that I thought would be valuable. Well, not one other, but several things. If you can start to grow some food where you live, and I mean you can get a little pot, a 6-inch pot or an 8-inch pot, or go to a farmer's market or a thieves market or something and buy a pot for $1 and get some dirt out of the ground and plant some herbs. You can start giving yourself something from the earth. And I think that helps with the resonance in your body and will help settle down any kind of anxiety from a trauma. And then addressing it from different directions is also helpful. But I think getting to know your neighbors is important. So we have all these wonderful little gadgets, our iPhones and our iPads and our computers, and I find myself ending up working on them diligently to get things done, and all of a sudden I realize I haven't talked to anybody in my day. And so make a phone call, go outside, greet your neighbor, offer to take the garbage out for the neighbor, say hello to the cat and the dog, take a walk, and get to know your neighbor and your community, and that will help start to heal the trauma that you might have. You won't feel as alone in it, and you'll know that there are others who have things they're dealing with as well. And that comes to being really responsible for the way that you live. So I'm being very chatty. Rebecca, how do you feel about being responsible for yourself and what you can do in controlling your own environment? Or go ahead, do you have some comments? I've hogged the mic.
Well, I guess I'd circle it back around to trauma, in the sense that if you know that you are affected by trauma and you're carrying that, is to be able to move out of maybe some place of victim mentality and doing what you can do to heal from within. And the last piece I'd like to share, probably about trauma that's kind of less heard of, but is trauma with as adults, with things that you wouldn't necessarily think of traumatic. For example, like a doctor's visit, where maybe a dental visit where something goes wrong, things like that just kind of are out of the blue. And I encourage people to really consider looking into finding solutions to this, because your life quality is everything. And how you show up for your family members, how you show up for your children. And, in a nutshell, trauma can really siphon off a lot of your life force energy if you're trying to suppress those memories, if you're trying to suppress the anxiety after effects of it, the emotional after effects of it. You may think you're managing it just by putting it in a box, but it's like holding a beach ball under the water in a swimming pool. It takes effort and energy to hold something like that beneath the surface. So it can really keep many people in just surviving the day, because they don't have extra energy to be putting into new projects, to taking their career to the next level, to changing careers, to finding a sense of purpose. So I really encourage people to consider talking with someone or researching for themselves how they might address overcoming stressful events in life that they know in the back of their mind is influencing their energy, their happiness, their mood, their inner peace and calm. Because when you are able to heal those things, you have all this massive life force energy that you're going to harvest and take back into your life, that you can put into creating new relationships, new jobs, new avenues for yourself, new energy with friends and family members. So
I think that's great advice. And actually, I was thinking about what to leave everyone with today. And, if you have a chance to stand back and be quiet in your life, if you think about the people you love every day, and think about giving love to the people, even the people you greet in the grocery store, or when you're driving, if somebody is upset, just back off. Let them have their space. Don't fight with them. Don't resist. It brings more peace to you, and it will help in identifying your quality of life, which I think is a great point. In the 22 years that I've worked with Tomatis, clearing traumas through the listening program, through the Tomatis method, I've seen such change in people's lives, that they shift from seeing dulled colors to bright colors, that they shift from hearing off key to on key. They start singing in the shower and in the car. I mean, these are little tiny qualities that bring joy on a minute-to-minute basis. So, this was really good. Rebecca, thank you for talking about the trauma. And we miss Stela. We'll join you again the second Wednesday of August in this summer, this wonderful hot summer we're having in the South. And hope that we'll have some other discussions that will be of merit to you. And if you have any questions, certainly put them forward on our website. I think we're able to. Are they able to write questions on our website? Or send us an email through the website, Healthy View, Healthy You, and we'll try to address them. And we really thank you all for being with us. So, Rebecca, have a great day.
Thanks. You too, Len. And
thank you.
Great day to everyone watching.
Yeah, thank you. Great. See you in a month. Bye.
Bye.